James, moving on to the Currie Cup, semi-finals confirmed. North-South derby, as we all predicted. Rob?
It was. We've got the lineup that I think that everybody wanted. Really, I think Western Province against the Bulls at Newlands and Lions Sharks in Johannesburg. Very appropriate billings, I think. The two correct teams got the home games based on not just log position, but their form throughout the season. The two most constructive teams, I think, Western Province and the Lions, deservedly get the home semi-finals. The one thing you can say is that although they will both go into the semis as favourites, we got reminders in the last round of league activity that you also can't write off either of the Bulls or the Sharks. The Bulls have got a little bit of a late charge going. Although I'm not certain yet whether they have quite the finesse to their game and the sort of multi-dimensional facets to really bother Western Province. But Province will be quite nervous about the game, there's no question. And similarly, I think the Lions will be well aware that the Sharks, who kept their composure very well against what was quite a difficult date against this kind of Western Province B team, if you like. When you're playing against a team that's already sort of structured to be minnows, it actually can be quite difficult to plan for them and to get the right psychology to beat them, especially as the Sharks already knew that they couldn't improve on their position on the table. So it was a strange game at Newlands, quite a good one in the end. They came from, obviously, 12 points down, I think, Aaron, to turn the game around completely. And the way the Sharks pack took command of that second half will be something that will be giving them a little bit of a fillip ahead of facing a really meaty Lions pack next weekend. So we've got ourselves a very pleasing last four situation, I think.
Just looking at the results from this final round, Garen, I mean, I guess a bit of surprise was the Kings finally getting a win. But did anyone expect the Lions to thump the Cheetahs like they did?
Well, I think I predicted that the Kings would finish 0-10, but hats off to them, Carlos Spencer, the coach, for picking up their first victory of the season. They knocked over the Pumas in the end by a single point. Bad finish to the season for the Pumas, who promised so much early on. Sort of failed to deliver at the business end of the tournament. I think they finished 6th in the end. So good for the Kings. They'll hopefully build on that in the coming seasons. But like you said, the Cheetahs Lions game was the score that blew out the most this week, and I was quite surprised by how poor the Cheetahs were and how good the Lions actually were. We talked about that the Cheetahs were the one team that benefited the most from the returning Springboks. They had 3 in their pack, but they were completely overwhelmed at that. In the front row, tight 5, even all 8 forwards. So I did pick the Lions as sort of the outside team for this year's tournament, based mainly on the fact that they haven't had many changes at all from their Super Rugby 2 Currie Cup team. And it seems like Johan Ackerman's working wonders there. It doesn't matter who sort of falls out, they'll find somebody to do an adequate job. And they just roll on. They've picked up now their home semi-final, not much more they could have asked for there. I think they're going to be tough to beat. The Sharks team, they went on to Newlands, as Rob said. It's difficult to play against a team that's made 11 changes, because those 11 players that came in sort of fighting for their own spots in the semi-finals for Western Province. So the Province team certainly wasn't, when you looked at them on the field, even though you didn't maybe perhaps know who the 11 players were, they certainly put their hands up. And the Sharks struggled at times. I wasn't really impressed by Kobus Reinach. I actually thought the Sharks played better when he was off the field. They certainly came back later on in the last 30 minutes of that match. So they'll have a lot to work on. They did beat the Lions in Durban by a couple of points a couple of weeks ago. So I think the Lions will certainly start that match at home as favourites, and it might even be as many as sort of like 7 or 8 points. I haven't checked what the bookies are saying yet, but they certainly will be tough to beat. But having said that, I think Western Province will also be equally tough to beat at home. The Bulls, the match against the Griquas this weekend wasn't the best game of rugby, even though the score again blew out a little bit. That Griquas team was woefully short of form players and experienced players. They had a number of injuries, a red card as well. So I think that scoreline flattered the Bulls a little bit. I see this talk about Andre Pollard now playing at centre, keeping Potgieter at number 10, sort of trying to get everyone back in some sort of position so they can play. And I think they'll be better. And big North-South derby, there's a lot to prove for the Bulls. But I think if the form book and the teams that deserve to qualify for the final, it will be the Western Province Lions final at Newlands in a couple of weeks' time.
Rob, just in terms of Springboks that are available and returning for the semi-finals, I mean, are there going to be any new faces? And just looking at the Lions and how they've just had this consistency in selection. The Sharks have got far more Springboks. The Lions have really come a long way from being relegated in Super Rugby not so long ago.
They have, absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned Springboks, because I think one of the relevant factors for this end of year tour coming up is that the Lions, especially if they go on to either win the Currie Cup or certainly go all the way to the final and just confirm what a good season they've had, is that I think several of their forwards, especially a couple of front rankers, Schalk van der Merwe, Julian Redlinghuis, Ruan Dreyer, all props who have looked really, really good this season, and that there's still perhaps a couple of vacancies in sort of in Springbok front row depth, if you like, for a 4-match tour of Europe. So as much as anything, we're going to get an interesting development in the next couple of weeks with watching how some of the Lions tight forwards shape, with just the possibility that they might end up getting berths on the tour. Of course, Warren Whiteley back in the Lions mix, he makes a big difference to them just strategically with the sort of captaincy calls, and he's been integral to their sort of their upward strides that they've made. Handré Pollard, of course, he's a big story. The new sort of wonder boy of South African fly half play. As Garen said, a chance that he might play it inside centre. Where, by the way, he could do a particularly good job. I think he's got the sort of Dan Carter sort of skills. I'm not saying he's anywhere near from a reputation point of view yet to somebody like Dan Carter, who's an absolute legend already. But at this early stage of his career, he's showing enough versatility, I think, to show that he can do a job at number 12. We know that he's got the physique, the defensive acumen to adjust to number 12. Although I also wonder if they'd be missing a trick if they did keep him at number 12 rather than sort of closer to the sort of the boiler room of decision making and stuff, if you like, a little bit closer in the fly half channel. Yes, Jacques-Louis Potgieter is a very steady individual, but I think there'll be quite a few Bulls fans hoping that Frans Ludeker actually installs Pollard into his favourite and in-form position for the game against Province, where he will obviously be a key element of the Bulls' hopes for an upset.
Sorry, I think actually part of the problem is I read that Burger Odendaal, who's one of the finds for the Bulls in midfield, he looks like he's going to miss out, so they need somebody to play there. So I think they're just thinking, keep Potgieter at 10 and we'll find a spot for Pollard rather than them starting him on the bench like they did this weekend. Slot him in at number 12 and see what he can do there. Obviously, they'll be up against Jean de Jong and whoever else Province pick at in the midfield. So interesting to see what old Frans Ludeker does decide in his selection.